I couldn't stop staring at my neighbor. Then she smiled and whispered, "Want me to stare back?" The first time I noticed her, she was tending to her small garden in the soft light of late afternoon. The sunlight caught strands of her hair, turning them into a halo that seemed almost deliberate, though I knew better. It was just the way the world sometimes conspires to make ordinary moments feel extraordinary. I was leaning against my doorway, a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hands, pretending to scroll through my phone, but all I could focus on was her. She moved with a calm, deliberate grace, hands brushing gently against the leaves as she watered her plants. There was an elegance in the way she tilted her head, the faint crease of concentration between her brows. It wasn't just beauty, it was experience, confidence, a life lived fully yet quietly. I felt a sudden pang of curiosity. Who was she beyond the neat rows of flowers and the bright smile she occasionally offered to neighbors she barely knew? And then she noticed me. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle flick of her eyes toward mine, a pause in her movements, and a soft, knowing smile that seemed to acknowledge my presence without judgment. My chest tightened slightly, a warmth spreading in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The smile wasn't flirtatious in a brazen way, it was quiet, teasing, and infinitely more powerful because it left the rest unsaid. My heart whispered, "Do I dare look again?" I did. I watched as she adjusted the watering can, her fingers curling around the handle with effortless precision. The soft scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers reached me, carried lightly on the breeze. She hummed something almost imperceptible under her breath, a melody I imagined lingered in her mind even when she wasn't singing. I found myself unconsciously memorizing the details, the subtle lines of her hands, the warmth of her smile, the gentle curve of her posture as she leaned over the plants. And yet, there was hesitation. A quiet voice in my head reminded me of the obvious, the age gap, the social norms, the risk of being too forward in my curiosity. But each time I tried to look away, my gaze returned, drawn back by something intangible. It wasn't lust or shallow admiration, it was a pull toward the human warmth she radiated, the comfort she seemed to carry effortlessly, and the silent promise that she noticed the small things, just as I did. As the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the yard, she caught my eye again. This time, her smile lingered a fraction longer, a playful challenge, an unspoken question. I flushed slightly, caught in the delicate tension between fascination and propriety. In that fleeting moment, I felt an entire story unfold in my mind, one that I wasn't yet ready to live, but couldn't stop imagining. And just like that, the ordinary afternoon became something unforgettable. A quiet intrigue settled between us, subtle yet electric, leaving me both exhilarated and painfully aware of how much I wanted to know her, yet feared the boundaries I might cross simply by daring to feel. From that day on, each glance, each subtle smile, became a small heartbeat in the rhythm of my life, drawing me closer to a story I knew was only just beginning. It wasn't long before our paths crossed outside her house. I had been lingering near the mailbox, pretending to check for letters, when I saw her step onto the porch, holding a cup of tea. The afternoon sunlight caught the edge of her hair again, giving it that same golden halo that had drawn my attention days before. She noticed me almost instantly, our eyes met, and I felt the familiar warmth in my chest, the subtle tightening of nerves that accompanied every encounter with her. This time, she didn't just smile from a distance. She walked toward the fence that separated our yards, a relaxed, confident sway in her stride. "You're staring again," she said, her voice soft but teasing, carrying a melody that seemed to linger in the air. "Want me to stare back?" I froze, unsure if I should laugh, protest, or simply melt on the spot. My lips parted, and a faint chuckle escaped me, betraying my nervous excitement. The world seemed to narrow to the space between us, the fence acting as both a boundary and a bridge. She leaned lightly against it, tilting her head as if weighing whether I was worth the trouble of a proper answer. Her gaze was steady, curious, and just intimate enough to make my pulse quicken. I tried to look casual, pretending to examine the grass at my feet, but I knew she could see through it. The playful glint in her eyes said she already had. "Maybe," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. But I think I'd need a proper reason first. Her laughter was soft, airy, and somehow wrapped around me like a warm blanket. She shook her head slightly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Curiosity is always reason enough," she said. That simple line, said with such ease, left me momentarily breathless. There was a subtle intimacy in the space between us. The breeze brushed past our arms, carrying the faint scent of her perfume, something floral, soft, and comforting. I noticed the curve of her fingers as she rested them on the fence, the way the sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, and the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she leaned forward slightly. Every detail pulled me in deeper, and yet, nothing felt rushed or forced. We lingered there, talking about mundane things, weather, the neighborhood, a stray cat that had wandered too close, but each word carried weight, each glance a spark of unspoken understanding. I felt the thrill of discovery, of realizing that this woman, so composed and assured, might actually enjoy my company as much as I was drawn to hers. When I finally turned to leave, I caught her eyes one last time. Her smile lingered, a private secret shared only between us. My steps back to my house felt lighter, almost buoyant, as if the day had been transformed into something extraordinary. That brief encounter, that playful tease, left a quiet imprint on my mind, the beginning of a connection that promised slow, careful unfolding, built on curiosity, shared glances, and the tender acknowledgement of each other's presence. And in that moment, I realized that this was no ordinary neighborly interaction, it was the first spark of something far deeper, something that would quietly, insistently pull us toward each other in ways I was only beginning to understand. In the days that followed, our interactions remained small, almost incidental, yet each one seemed charged with quiet significance. I found myself noticing her in ways that went beyond simple admiration. The way she carried herself on the porch, a soft hum of music escaping her lips as she watered the plants, the subtle tilt of her head as she glanced at a passing neighbor, the delicate way she tucked her hair behind her ear, exposing the gentle curve of her neck. Every detail was etched into my memory, an internal catalog I couldn't stop reviewing. I became hyper-aware of the ordinary moments that involved her. From my window, I watched as she checked the mail, her movements precise and effortless. The scent of her perfume, faint and floral, drifted occasionally across the small distance between our homes, catching me off guard and leaving a warmth behind my chest that I wasn't quite ready to name. A slight shiver would pass through me whenever her gaze flicked toward mine, and sometimes, for a fleeting heartbeat, I imagined what it might be like if our lives intersected more directly. One afternoon, I borrowed a ladder from her to fix a gutter on my own house. She was outside, and our hands brushed as she handed it to me. The contact was brief, accidental in its casualness, yet it sent a warmth through me that lingered far longer than necessary. She noticed, I could tell, not with words, but with the faint raise of her eyebrows and a small, almost imperceptible smile that suggested she understood the effect of even the simplest touch. Beyond physical cues, there was a growing sense of emotional resonance. She was kind, not performatively so, but in a way that suggested a deep understanding of people and moments. When I waved from my driveway or called a simple hello, she would respond with a smile that carried something more than politeness, recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of my attention and the subtle curiosity that seemed mutual. I often imagined conversations that hadn't yet happened, replaying small moments in my mind with exaggerated intimacy. I caught myself wondering about the stories behind her expressions, the quiet strength in her posture, the way she moved through her day with such composed grace. These thoughts were not intrusive, rather, they were a reflection of my growing admiration and a desire to know her fully, to understand the life she carried with such ease. Even simple gestures, a stray cat curling up near her feet, the way she paused to admire a flower, became profound moments in my internal narrative. I realized that I wasn't merely captivated by her appearance, I was drawn to the life she inhabited, the calm confidence tempered by subtle vulnerability. Every glance, every fleeting interaction, created a rhythm between us, a silent dialogue that neither of us had fully articulated, yet both of us seemed to understand. By the end of the week, a pattern had formed. I watched, she noticed, and something unspoken passed between us in those quiet observations. It was a delicate, electric tension that spoke of curiosity, attraction, and an emotional connection just beginning to take root. In that suspended space between longing and propriety, I felt a stirring I hadn't experienced in years, a quiet excitement that told me our story was just beginning, one glance, one smile, one small, meaningful interaction at a time. It happened on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, the kind that seemed destined to fade into forgettable routine. I was helping her carry a few potted plants from the porch to the garden, awkwardly maneuvering around the narrow pathway. She was ahead of me, effortlessly holding one of the heavier pots, her posture composed yet relaxed. The sunlight fell in golden strips through the trees, catching the highlights in her hair, and I couldn't help but notice the serene focus on her face. As I stepped closer to pass her a small gardening tool, our hands brushed lightly. It was a fleeting contact, the kind that could easily be dismissed as accidental, yet it sent an unmistakable warmth coursing through me. I felt the softness of her fingers against mine, the subtle pulse of life, the quiet steadiness that seemed to resonate with the rhythm of her being. She didn't pull away. Instead, she lingered for a heartbeat longer, her eyes meeting mine with a knowing glance that said everything and nothing at all. The world seemed to pause in that instant. I felt the familiar rush of awareness, my senses sharpening around her presence, the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the earthy aroma of the soil, the gentle warmth radiating from her skin where our hands had met, the softness of her smile that hovered on the edge of playful acknowledgement. I was acutely aware of the age and experience reflected in her eyes, the quiet confidence in the tilt of her chin, the gentle grace of her movements. We continued our work, but the subtle touch lingered between us like an unspoken promise. Every glance felt heavier, every brush of her sleeve against my arm a quiet conversation. The physical proximity was electric in its restraint, charged with a gentle tension that neither of us needed to articulate. I found myself stealing moments to observe the small details, the curve of her shoulders as she leaned over a plant, the delicate way her fingers adjusted the leaves, the soft exhale that escaped her lips when she paused to survey the garden. There was an intimacy in the simplicity of the act. The touch wasn't overt, and yet it carried a weight that made my chest tighten in the best possible way. It spoke of awareness, acknowledgement, and the beginning of something neither of us fully understood yet. I felt the stirrings of desire tempered by respect, the subtle pull of connection tempered by restraint. She seemed to sense it too, her eyes glinting briefly with amusement, her smile soft and unhurried, as if to say, "I see you, and I'm here, but let's take our time." After we finished arranging the plants, we stepped back to admire our work. The sunlight fell across her face, highlighting the gentle lines that spoke of experience, strength, and quiet vulnerability. I realized, in that moment, that it wasn't the touch itself that mattered, it was the awareness it created, the shared acknowledgement of proximity, the unspoken understanding that our interactions were no longer merely casual. Even as I walked back toward my house, I could still feel the warmth of her hand, the electric pulse of connection that lingered like a gentle echo. That first subtle touch had shifted something between us, a small, quiet step toward closeness, a delicate yet undeniable thread of intimacy beginning to weave its way through our days. And in that lingering warmth, I knew our story was slowly, deliberately unfolding, one tender brush of hands at a time. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that softens the edges of the world and invites quiet reflection. The patter of raindrops against the window created a steady rhythm, a gentle percussion that seemed to slow time itself. She invited me inside to wait out the storm, and I accepted, grateful for the warmth that seeped from her home and the quiet intimacy that seemed to hang in the air like suspended sunlight. We settled on the couch, each with a cup of tea, steam curling lazily into the air. I noticed the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the earthy aroma of rain that clung to her clothes, a combination both comforting and disarming. She sat close, knees nearly touching mine, the faint warmth from her side radiating through the thin barrier of fabric. For a moment, silence filled the space, heavy yet not uncomfortable, a shared pause in which unspoken thoughts hovered between us. Our conversation began with small things, the weather, the storm, the creaking of the old house, but soon, it turned toward quieter, more personal topics. She spoke of her childhood home, the places she had lived, the choices she had made, each word carefully measured yet revealing the subtle vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. I listened, enthralled, feeling as though I were being led into a private room in her life, one not open to many. There was a softness in her gaze that contrasted beautifully with the confidence she carried in the outside world. She tilted her head slightly as she spoke, eyes searching mine, as if gauging my response, gauging whether I could understand without judgment. I found myself relaxing into her presence, letting my own walls come down, sharing fragments of my life I usually kept private, the small regrets, the quiet loneliness, the fears that lingered in the corners of my mind. Her hand brushed against mine when she laughed softly at a self-deprecating story I told, lingering for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. It wasn't dramatic or romantic in the obvious sense, but it carried an intimacy that made my chest tighten in a way that words could never convey. I noticed the gentle curve of her fingers, the warmth of her skin, the calm steadiness of her presence, and I realized how deeply this simple touch resonated with me. As the rain tapped steadily on the windows, our conversation drifted into pauses, comfortable silences filled with the unspoken understanding of shared vulnerability. The faint flicker of candlelight highlighted the subtle lines on her face, signs of experience and wisdom that made her presence feel grounded and real. I felt a protective urge, tempered with admiration, a desire to be close without overwhelming her, to listen without intruding, to share without rushing. By the time the rain eased, I realized that something had shifted between us. The brief touches, the lingering glances, the shared confidences, they had woven a delicate thread connecting us in a way that was intimate yet safe. The slow-burn tension had deepened, transforming mere attraction into emotional resonance. In that quiet room, with the storm outside and the warmth between us, I felt the beginnings of a connection that promised patience, depth, and a steady unfolding of something meaningful. It was early evening, the kind where the sun hangs low and golden across the neighborhood, painting everything in a warm, almost magical glow. I had been sitting on my porch, pretending to read, though my attention had long since drifted. Across the fence, she was tending to her garden again, a picture of calm composure as the soft breeze lifted strands of her hair. Something about the way the sunlight caught her profile made my chest tighten, the familiar pull of fascination, curiosity, and desire threaded itself through every fiber of my being. I caught myself staring, and for the first time in days, I didn't look away immediately. Maybe it was the soft rhythm of her movements, the gentle sway of her shoulders, or the faint curve of her smile that hinted she was aware. Then she noticed. Her gaze lifted, meeting mine with a directness that sent a jolt through me. And then she smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that was both playful and intimate. "You're staring again," she said, her voice low and teasing, carrying a melody that seemed to vibrate just for me. "Want me to stare back?" I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, the heat rising to my face in a flush I couldn't hide. There was something electrifying in the way she said it, not a challenge, not a provocation, but a quiet invitation. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, amusement, and a subtle awareness of the tension that had been building between us for days. I swallowed, my voice caught somewhere between nervous and eager. "Maybe," I managed, my words sounding foreign even to myself. "But I don't know if I can handle it." Her laugh was soft, airy, and intoxicating, wrapping around me like a warm current. She leaned slightly closer across the fence, and for a fraction of a second, the space between us seemed charged with more than just proximity. The faintest brush of her hand against the edge of the wooden fence sent shivers down my spine. I noticed every detail, her eyelashes catching the last rays of sunlight, the gentle tilt of her head, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. Each element was magnified, heightened by the electric tension that now filled the air. Neither of us moved to break the unspoken spell. Every glance, every heartbeat, every pause in the conversation seemed weighted with meaning. I felt the thrill of vulnerability mingled with the pull of desire, tempered by a mutual understanding of boundaries, respect, and the slow pace we had both instinctively agreed to follow. The moment stretched, suspended between teasing and unspoken longing. I realized that the fascination I had carried from the very first glance had evolved into something deeper, an emotional connection layered with anticipation, curiosity, and a quiet acknowledgement of mutual attraction. Her teasing smile was a bridge between our unspoken feelings and the possibility of something more, each second adding to the slow burn intensity that neither of us could ignore. As the sun finally dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, I stepped back, trying to collect my composure. She held my gaze for one last heartbeat, and the playful, knowing expression on her face stayed with me long after I returned to my porch. The spark had ignited, the tension had reached its peak, and I knew that the next steps we took would be measured, deliberate, and deeply meaningful. In that fleeting evening light, I understood, this was the moment everything we had been quietly building between us began to truly awaken. The morning after our shared evening of teasing tension arrived calm and golden, sunlight spilling gently through the kitchen window. I found myself at her doorstep, holding 2 cups of coffee, my hands slightly trembling, not from nerves, but from the quiet excitement that had been building over weeks of glances, smiles, and subtle touches. She opened the door before I could knock, hair loosely pinned back, wearing a soft sweater that emphasized the graceful poise I had admired from afar. Her smile, warm and unhurried, immediately put me at ease. "Coffee?" I offered, holding out one of the cups. She accepted, her fingers brushing mine briefly, just enough to make me acutely aware of her presence, of the gentle warmth that always seemed to linger around her. That small contact, simple and innocent, carried the weight of all the silent moments we had shared, the touches, the glances, the unspoken words. We moved to the kitchen table, sitting across from one another, knees nearly touching as sunlight streamed over the surface between us. The quiet comfort of the room wrapped around us, filled with the scent of coffee and the faint traces of her perfume. I watched her stir sugar into her cup, noting the delicate curl of her fingers, the way her expression softened when she looked up at me. For a moment, time seemed suspended, each glance, each small motion imbued with the intimacy we had slowly nurtured. Our conversation started gently, about plans for the day and shared memories of small, mundane events, but quickly deepened. She spoke of her hopes and fears with a candidness that invited me to do the same. I felt a sense of closeness I hadn't anticipated, a rare comfort in revealing my own vulnerabilities while knowing she would listen without judgment. Each laugh, each pause, each subtle nod or lingering look added layers to our connection. At one point, her hand brushed mine again, not intentionally, yet deliberately enough to create a quiet electric charge. I held her gaze and smiled, realizing that in that moment, words were almost unnecessary. The warmth of her hand against mine, the gentle pressure, the calm steadiness, it spoke of trust, acknowledgement, and a shared understanding that we were exploring something meaningful together. She laughed softly at something I said, and I noticed how her eyes crinkled at the corners, the lines of experience blending with youthful warmth, creating a presence both comforting and exciting. I felt protective, yet inspired, wanting to savor the moment without pushing it too far, letting the slow burn rhythm of our connection dictate its own pace. By the time we finished our coffee, the sunlight had shifted, bathing the room in a soft afternoon glow. I realized, with a sense of quiet satisfaction, that the tension, the longing, and the curiosity that had defined our past interactions had transformed into something steady, warm, and mutual. There was no rush, no need for dramatics, just the subtle, profound comfort of knowing that we had found a place in each other's lives. As I left, our hands brushed once more, lingering slightly longer than before. Her eyes held mine, soft yet direct, and I felt the gentle echo of every shared glance, every unspoken word. Walking back to my porch, I understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning, a slow, deliberate unfolding of intimacy, trust, and emotional connection, built carefully, beautifully, and entirely on our own terms. The quiet warmth in my chest told me everything I needed to know. Our story had arrived at a place of contentment, yet promised the depth and richness of a connection that would continue to grow, gently and inevitably, over time. If you enjoyed this slow burn story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, so you won't miss the next tale of subtle glances, quiet tension, and heartwarming connections.